Hello everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I thought we would have kind of a fun little thought experiment, and that is to compare the experience and results of writing my first book versus my fourth book. I was just thinking recently, kind of how far I've come, and I thought, well, why don't I actually directly compare the experiences and the results of first book versus fourth book, and I wrote it down and was like, oh, this is kind of cool. I should share this. Because I think it's really easy to kind of get locked into the process of writing and writing books, and things happen and you have a book come out, and how weird is that? And you kind of lose sight of how far you've come. And I thought it would be fun for you guys to hear kind of the differences, compare and contrast, and it might give you some insights into your own writing and hope for the future. So I wrote my first book, which was a YA science fiction novel, from 2012 to 2013. I finished it in early 2013, and I completed my fourth book, which is The Stars We Steal, my second book that is going to be traditionally published, in 2018. I started it in July 2017, and I finished it in terms of a first draft in April. I turned it in, and then I just completed my second round of revisions just a few weeks ago. So all told, if we're only counting first drafts, it took me a little over a year to write the first draft of my first book, and it took me 9 months to write the first draft of my fourth book. So in many ways, I've maybe gotten a bit faster, especially considering my first book was 74,000 words and my fourth book drafted at 86,000 words. And just to throw a little data point into the mix, my third book, Brightly Burning, my debut, only took me 3 months to write a first draft, so it definitely kind of varies per book, but overall, I think and hope I have learned to write more faster. So as you know, I am a pantser or a discovery writer. I don't know everything when I go into my book, and let's compare and contrast. For my first book, I knew the beginnings, the inciting incident. The middle-ish, I kind of knew what was going to happen, though I wouldn't necessarily call it a midpoint turn, and I definitely knew the ending. The ending was very firm in my mind when I set out to write my first book. Compare that to my fourth book, I think I've become more adventurous and loosey-goosey in a lot of ways. I only really knew the beginning and the end, so far as the romantic arc was concerned, because it's a retelling of Persuasion, so I knew where the romance needed to go, but I figured out everything else as I was going along. Now, my first book I revised 4 times total before I got an agent, and my fourth book I've revised it twice with my editor, so definitely technically less revision, but my first book had one major overhaul and then a lot of fine-tuning. Those other revisions were done as R&Rs with an agent. Whereas this fourth book, only 2 revisions, but I'd call both of them semi-major. I really did major surgery on the book, and if you've watched my revision vlogs, you know I compare it to the skeleton stayed the same and I just kind of moved organs around. That is definitely accurate. It feels like I did more work on my fourth book, but I actually think it's because I have a much greater sense of story and it was easier to pointedly get that book to where it needed to be. Another huge difference between my first book and my fourth book. So my first book, I got to about 20,000 words, and then I needed validation. I needed feedback and permission to move forward. I sent it to several critique partners that I had at the time, and I waited. And I'm gonna be perfectly frank with you, I don't even think half of them ever got back to me. And it ended up really stalling me on the book though. I basically stopped at the first act and was waiting for someone to say, yes, it's working, keep going. And it did stall me in the writing process. But on the fourth book, I said, screw it. I'm not gonna wait for other people to give me permission to write. If I'm vibing with this and I feel like it's working, which I did as I was drafting, I'm just gonna move forward. Feedback is gravy, not the meat. Mixed metaphors. And as you know, I have a whole writing hack on this, learning to write and thrive on your own, and that is definitely a huge lesson I learned between writing my first book and writing subsequent books. So let's talk about the muddled middle. On my first book, writing the middle was hard. It was the longest and slowest chunk of my writing process because I didn't quite know what I was doing. As I mentioned, I didn't really have like a midpoint turn in mind, and ultimately, massive chunks of my book ended up being boring. The pacing was really dragging. I threw out a ton in the middle and rewrote a lot because I needed to actually give it a midpoint turn. Let's compare that to my fourth book. Middles are always hard, but for my fourth book, I came up with a really cool midpoint turn. Though it's really more the break into three, but I digress. And it's the twist that really unlocked the whole book for me, and I powered through my middle, and I was really excited to write it. I ended up doing some edits on that middle. If you've watched my revision vlog, again, you'll know I ended up like throwing out a dinner scene and putting in something more interesting to basically give the middle a bit more momentum, but largely the middle stayed the same. Nothing essential really had to be rewritten, and so as you write more books and you develop as a writer, things are always going to be hard, but you get much closer to nailing it the first time you write something. So another huge difference between the first and the fourth book, like an essential piece of growth. The thing about your first novel that you ever write, that you ever complete, is as you're writing it, you don't know if you're ever going to finish because you've never written a novel before, you've never finished before. And so your entire writing process is fueled by niggling self-doubt. It's honestly what makes writing the first book so hard. It's why I give so many pep talks on this channel, and the advice really is just to push through it and fight perfectionism and keep going and not listen to that little flicker of self-doubt. Because the huge difference writing my fourth book is, once you've written a book, you know you can write a book. I was filled with absolute confidence in myself that the first one wasn't a fluke, because in fairness, this was my fourth book. I've written others. I knew I was gonna finish this book, even if it was hard, even if I had bad days, and that confidence helped me push along, have better ideas, and finish faster, writing more. Now let's talk about word counts in writing faster and writing more. I haven't actually stopped being an on average slower writer, in the sense that a good session for me is 500 to 1,000 words, which isn't like a ton of words. And I don't exactly remember what my best day on my first book was, but I would guess it was between like 2,500 and 3,000 words, and it was probably a day when I was barreling downhill and writing the ending. I remember writing the end of my first book being pretty fast. My best day on my fourth book, I believe, was 6,000 words, and that was part of a 10,000 word weekend. Again, I was on deadline and I had to write a lot. So again, I've definitely learned to push myself harder, write more when I need to, and I'm writing longer books faster. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about the meat of the book. What actually gets on the page in my first draft, first book versus fourth book, because when I really thought about it, I realized how far I had come. So the first draft of my first book had a lot of filler. As I told you, huge chunks of it ended up being boring, and I had a really great critique partner who told me that. She was like, ooh, I was kind of bored, and that's what told me, oh, you need a much better midpoint turn and you need more conflict. So I had a lot of filler, I didn't have enough conflict. My romance arc, as such as it was very, very, very slow. And I had a lot of melodrama. That was something I definitely ended up having to edit, and I don't think I ever fully expunged from the draft, remembering that my first book didn't sell. Whereas now on my fourth book, I don't have problem hitting beats pretty organically. You know I don't outline, but I have kind of the internalized story beats and 3-act structure kind of baked into things. And I don't have a problem hitting them, keeping conflict going. There's always pacing to be adjusted, but I've gotten much better at hitting it on the first draft. I have melodrama, but it's intentional. There are parts where I want it to be very dramatic and soapy in this book in particular, but I actually know what I'm doing. Whereas on my first book, I would write the big dramatic confrontation scene or the kissing scene or what have you, and oh my gosh, the dialogue I had coming out of these characters' mouths, whew, it was like from a bad soap opera, and you know, the villain sounded like a Bond villain and that kind of stuff. Now when that happens in my books, because I want it to. I've gotten much better at kind of things just feeling organic and real, and things developing off of organic emotional arcs, which is very, very important. And then the romance. I've just learned how to write a better romance arc. Even though I did end up revising it a few times, it wasn't because the arc wasn't there or the arc was terrible, but because I decided in the fourth book that I wanted to change the way that it worked for the reader. So generally the biggest difference is my first ever book, my first ever draft, needed a lot of rewriting so that stuff actually happened. I don't have a problem with that anymore. Stuff definitely happens in the book. Revising becomes more about layering and kind of rewriting to add complexity and kind of alter emotional or character arcs to change the reading experience. So I've just leveled up. And finally, the biggest difference between my first book and my fourth book, as I mentioned, my first book didn't sell. I did get an agent and we went on submission, but it just didn't work for the market. No one was interested in buying it. And my fourth book was written on contract. I wrote my fourth book knowing people would actually read it, which can I tell you is moderately terrifying, but I think it lent a different weight to writing it. It had to be a real book because it's a real book that people are going to read. And that's the demonstration of how far I've come. My first book was proving to myself that I could write a book, and of course trying to get my foot in the door of the industry. I learned my own writing process. I learned my own weaknesses as a writer. My fourth book was working around my weaknesses as a writer, you know, reinforcing the draft with the things I am good at, and then consciously taking time when I was revising to work on the things I'm not as good at. And I already know how to write a novel in the sense that I know I can finish one. This book was kind of pushing myself and challenging myself to try different things, you know, to challenge myself more with characters and plot twists and tone. Think about it. I finished my first book 5 years ago, and now I finished my fourth and it's gonna be on bookshelves next year-ish. That's bonkers. I've come a long way and I'm really proud of myself. And so whether you're on your first book or your fourth or your 10th, you're always learning and growing as you write subsequent books. Everything is a learning experience. I'm curious, if you're watching, if you've written more than one book, what are some of the biggest differences you've noticed between your first ever book and newer books? Where are the areas where you have leveled up? Writing is always hard, but in some ways has writing those books become easier? It's definitely become easier for me just in the sense of that confidence that I can finish. It makes a huge difference when it comes to kind of pushing through when it's hard, and I really kind of appreciate that because seriously, I just remember that hopeless feeling on book one of, can I do this? Will I ever do this? And then you do, and it's the best. So give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. I've enjoyed this walk down memory lane and I hope you found it interesting. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and as always, happy writing.